Okay, this video is going to talk about the roots of the inflation crisis and then talk about the 1972 presidential election and then look at the oil shock of 1973. Right? Again, if there's one thing the 70s are remembered for, it is the inflation crisis. And so we're going to take a look at that. All of the 70s presidents will be unable to deal with the inflation problem. So let's get to work on this. And I'll come back and put in a number as soon as I figure out what the order here is going to be. Inflation began to creep up in the late 60s, and it's really spun out of control in the 1970s. Between 1972 and 1975, the cost of a house increased 50%. Between August 72 and August 73, the cost of meat, poultry, and fish increased 40%. And the fact is that financially, most Americans were worse off in 1979 than they had been in 1970. And the only other decade where we saw this happen was in the 1930s. Okay? By April of 1980, interest rates were hitting 20%. An ounce of gold was up to $875 by 1980. In 1970, it cost $35. Okay? So we have a real serious inflation problem in the 1970s. And we need to take a look at the roots of that because it's going to, dealing with it is going to affect all of the 70s and even into the 80s. We'll still be having an inflation problem. So let's roll all the way back to the 1950s. During the 1950s, the United States had had 3 recessions, okay? And the worst one had been from 1958 to 1960, okay? Now, these recessions were actually important. Because they took war dollars out of the economy. During World War II, the United States had spent a lot of money. It had printed a lot of money to fight the war. And so those dollars, there had been an inflation problem at the end of World War II. And those recessions in the 1950s had squeezed out war inflation. Okay? So they were economically important. Politically, they were disastrous. At the same time this is happening, the Soviet Union is reporting an increase of GDP, gross domestic product, 10% per year. Now, there are 2 things to keep in mind, though. One, the Soviets were lying, okay? And 2, when you start as low on the economic ladder as the Soviets did, 10% a year is actually pretty good. It's expected. For the United States, a GDP increase by the 1950s of 3 to 4% per year was about expected. The United States in the 1950s was a fully functioning economy. So 2, 3, 4% growth of GDP, that's normal. With the Soviet Union, when you're starting from so little, 10% per year is normal. But the Soviets were also lying. So when Kennedy became president, his plan was to hold down interest rates to nearly 0%. And I quote here, "We Democrats believe that the economy can and must grow at an average rate of 5% annually. In the first step in speeding economic growth, a Democratic president will put an end to the present high interest rate, tight money policy." Now, what does that mean when interest rates go down? When interest rates go down, it becomes easier to borrow money. So lowering interest rates injects money into the economic engine. Okay. Now you have to be careful, because if you inject too much money, then you might have an inflation problem. However, Kennedy was willing to accept a risk of inflation because it was thought, and we now know this to be drastically wrong. Let me make sure I get this correct. Okay. It was believed that inflation and unemployment were actually opposites. And so what this means is that as I need an arrow pointing up, thank you. As inflation went up, theoretically, unemployment went down. It was believed that inflation and unemployment ran in opposite directions. Now, we now know this not to be true. We're going to find out the hard way that inflation and unemployment can actually run upwards at the same time. But at the time, it was believed that inflation and unemployment actually ran in opposite directions. And so Kennedy was willing to risk this particular crisis. And for a while, it actually worked. Okay. By unemployment dropped to 3.5%, which is essentially full employment as far as the government's concerned. And inflation stayed at 2% in 1965. Okay, 3%. 1966. So that's about normal. But then after 1966, two things happened that caused inflation to start getting out of control. Okay. Remember, inflation occurs Because there are too many dollars in circulation. Why so many dollars in circulation after 1965, 66? One, Vietnam, so war spending, and two, LBJ's Great Society, social/safety net spending. And your book has a lot more to say about the Great Society. Both of these are pumping tremendous amounts of dollars into circulation. Okay, if you've ever heard economists sometimes talk about guns versus butter, this is what they're talking about. Okay, military spending versus domestic social safety spending. Okay, and that's what we've got here. Instead of having guns versus butter, what we've decided is that we're going to have guns and butter. We're going to have war spending and social safety spending, and that's going to cause inflation. Okay. Now, by 1968, inflation is at 4%. Okay. The smart thing to do here, okay, be to raise interest rates, which would take dollars out of circulation. Okay, that's the smart thing to do. It is not politically popular to do that, because what essentially you're doing here is causing a recession. All right, and if you think of this like a car, if you try to stop the car too quickly, you might go into a skid and crash. So what you're really wanting to do here is to gently tap the brakes on the economy and kind of slow down. Okay, if you hit the brakes too hard, you're going to lead to a big recession. Okay, so instead of gently stopping the car, you will slam in, you'll hit the brakes, spin out of control, slam it into something. All right. This is also sometimes called cooling the economy. Okay? If you take dollars out of circulation, that's sometimes called cooling the economy. If you put dollars into circulation, it's called heating the economy. LBJ refuses to cool the economy. Okay, he refuses to tap the brakes. Why? He's already unpopular over Vietnam. The last thing he needs is to throw a recession in an election year. Okay? You don't want to have a recession when you're running for president. George H.W. Bush found that out the hard way in 1992. Nixon also refused to fuel the economy. And so what we're going to have here is chaos in the economy. There will be an attempt in 1970, by raising some of the interest rates. Okay. So again, it doesn't work. Basically what happens is a full-blown recession kicks in. Now, economically, that is the smart thing to do, is to just buckle up and ride out the recession. Because if you have a recession, you can do something about the inflation. Nixon, though, doesn't want to do that. And so what happens is the money supply is actually increased by 10%. So we're basically going to pretend there's no recession. This leads us to the 1972 presidential election. What are we doing here? Well, let's look at what's going on. The incumbent, Richard Nixon, is up for re-election. He's sitting on a recession and an unpopular war that refuses to come to an end. All right. By all rights, Nixon should have really been vulnerable in 1972. The Democrats decided to put up a guy named George McGovern. The Democratic Party in the 1970s had problems. Okay? It had a dilemma. The problem with the Democratic Party is that there were essentially two wings. There was the old left, and there was the new left. And these groups really didn't get along with each other. The old left, which is the old people who had come into the Democratic Party back when Franklin Roosevelt was president, labor, pro-America, which means they support the Vietnam War, a lot of veterans, okay? So basically, if you've ever seen Archie Bunker, if you haven't, you should. We're basically talking about Archie Bunker here, okay? Some veterans in the New Left, mainly Vietnam veterans who decided the war really wasn't worth it, but also the New Left, very much college, anti-war, veterans also against the war, civil rights, gay rights, women's rights. So basically they're represented by Michael, who was Archie's son-in-law, who Archie referred to as Meathead. And so you have this split in the Democratic Party that was never resolved throughout most of the 1970s. It first becomes apparent here in 1972. McGovern was very much over on the side of the New Left, and that was perfect as far as Nixon was concerned. So what did this mean for the election? Well, for the first time since 1932, the largest labor union in the United States did not support the Democratic nominee for president. That had not happened in 40 years. They didn't support the Republican nominee, Richard Nixon, but officially they took no stance on either of the two candidates. So a lot of the old left So what happened on election day is that the old left either didn't vote for anybody for president, they went and voted, but they left president blank, or they voted for Nixon because Nixon had shown himself to be the law and order president. All right. Nixon had figured out that if you can get people to vote based on what they hate, based on what is in their bank account, you can win elections all day long. Okay, this is something that segregationist politicians had learned back in the 50s. Orville Faubus, George Wallace, all those segregationists had learned that if you could get people to vote based on hate instead of what was best for their checkbook, you can win elections all day long. And so Nixon wins this election big time. Of course, Watergate will eventually undo Nixon. In 1973, the price of oil quadrupled. Holy smokes. What the hell? Well, oil prices had already been going up in order to buy weapons. Remember, we talked about the Nixon doctrine. And so Iran, Iraq, places like that have been raising their oil prices in order to buy weapons from the United States. Okay. In October 6, 1973, war broke out. When Egypt and Syria invaded Israel and came pretty close to wiping out Israel. However, U.S. support to Israel turned the tide of the war, and within 2 weeks, Israeli tanks were parked outside of Cairo. OPEC's response typing too fast. To stop selling oil to nations. Was to stop selling oil to nations that supported Israel. And this caused the price of oil to quadruple, literally overnight. Oil prices quadrupled. What about American oil? All right. Well, because of the inflation crisis, the Nixon administration had actually put price controls on oil to keep prices low. And what that led to is that oil production within the United States, that is the pumping of oil in the United States, simply fell off. Okay, if X equals how much it costs to get the oil out of the ground and process it, and Y is how much I can sell it for, and those numbers are too close to each other, then screw it. Okay, I'm just not going to pump the oil. And so American oil production had already been falling off because of this. What this led to was in a number of states, you couldn't put up Christmas decorations in 1973. Gas stations could not sell gasoline on Sundays. Overseas in Europe, if you had a private boat, you could not operate it. If you had a private plane, you could not fly it. If you had a car in Europe, you could not drive the car on Sundays. So again, between the drop in American oil production and the fact that OPEC had stopped selling oil to the United States, probably the most famous thing are the gas shortages, where, again, there just wasn't gas. Or you would be reduced, you would say, you could only buy 2 gallons of gas. And that became sort of the symbol of the 1973 oil shock. OPEC also began to flex its muscles, its power in foreign affairs. Most notably, in 1977, France arrested the planner of the 1972 Munich massacre. In 1972, 11 Israeli athletes had been killed by terrorists at the Olympics. And there's a pretty good movie Spielberg made, whose name I am forgetting. Munich? That seems like it would be too easy to just call it Munich. Let's see. Let's roll down here to... No, it's called Munich. Okay. Anyway, that was easy. So the Spielberg movie Munich covers this. It also covers Israel's retaliation. But they caught him. France did. 1977, they caught the guy. OPEC pressured France to release the guy where they would turn off oil to France until France released them. And in fact, between 1972 and 1974, 50 Arab terrorists arrested were cut loose under pressure from OPEC. What caused oil prices to come down? Okay. Because the prices will eventually come down. Now they're going to go back up again. There's another oil shock in the late 70s, which we may or may not get to. Why did they come down here? One, new sources are tapped in Latin America. Two, improved efficiency in automobiles, particularly when Japan starts making serious inroads into the American car market. And finally, OPEC nations, they couldn't embargo forever. I mean, what else does Saudi Arabia have besides oil? Especially in the 70s. Today, Saudi Arabia is somewhat diversifying its economy, but in the 70s, that's all they had was oil. They can't not sell it forever. Eventually, they're going to need money. And so prices eventually began to come back down again after Nixon had already left office. All right. The next lecture you're going to see will be about Watergate. And then after that, we will pick up with the Ford and Carter years, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter's presidencies. All right, so I will see you at the Watergate.